The wealthy father disowned his daughter for marrying a poor man, but years later she gave him a gift he could never imagine. It all started in a grand estate, one that stretched across acres of land, with towering gates and perfectly trimmed hedges. Inside the mansion lived a man named Charles Donovan, a wealthy businessman who had worked his way to the top through years of grit and determination. He was the type of man who valued power and money above all else, and his life reflected that. He controlled a massive company, had influence over countless people, and lived in a world where everything had its price. But there was one thing in his life that didn't come with a price tag: his daughter, Emily. She was his only child, the apple of his eye. Charles had always imagined a bright future for her, one that would carry on the legacy he had built. Emily had grown up surrounded by luxury, attending the best schools and mingling with the children of other elite families. Charles expected her to marry someone with the same status, someone who could not only take care of her, but also benefit his empire. Everything was going according to plan, or so Charles thought. That was until Emily met someone who would turn his entire world upside down. His name was Daniel, a man from a modest background. He didn't come from money, didn't have the connections Charles hoped for, and to make matters worse, he was an artist, someone who lived on passion rather than profit. To Charles, this was the ultimate betrayal. When Emily tells her father about Daniel, Charles doesn't try to hide his disappointment. He was furious. He had given her everything, and in his eyes, she was throwing it all away for a man who had nothing to offer her. He didn't even care to meet Daniel. To him, it didn't matter who the man was. He saw only one thing: a future that wasn't part of his plan. Despite Charles's anger, Emily was firm in her decision. She loved Daniel, and no amount of wealth or influence could change that. She had never seen her father so upset, and part of her felt guilty, but she couldn't ignore her heart. She stood her ground, which only pushed her father further away. Things escalated quickly. Charles gave Emily an ultimatum: either she leaves Daniel or she leaves the family. It was a choice he never imagined he'd have to make, but he felt certain Emily would come to her senses. After all, no one in their right mind would give up a life of comfort and security for something as unpredictable as love. But Emily wasn't like her father. She chose love. The decision left Charles stunned. He never believed she would walk away from everything, especially not from him. But she did. She packed her bags, took what little she needed, and left the mansion that had been her home all her life. Charles watched her go with a cold stare, refusing to call out to her or change his mind. To him, it was as if she no longer existed. The doors of the estate closed behind her, and for years they stayed that way. Little did Charles know this was only the beginning of a long road that would eventually lead to a gift more precious than any amount of wealth he had ever known. Years passed, and Charles Donovan lived as if his daughter Emily had never existed. He poured himself deeper into his business, expanding his empire, making deals, and growing his wealth even further. To the outside world, he was still a powerful businessman, cold and calculated, respected and feared by his peers. But within the walls of his grand estate, there was a silence that no amount of money could fill. Emily, on the other hand, had stepped into a completely different life. When she left her father's mansion, she and Daniel had little more than the clothes on their backs and their love for each other. It wasn't easy. They moved into a small apartment in a part of town that Emily had never known, a world far from the luxury she grew up with. They had to make do with very little, and for someone who had never worried about money, it was a shock to Emily's system. But despite the hardships, Emily didn't regret her choice. She found something in her new life that she never had before: freedom. She and Daniel faced their struggles together, and each day they learned more about each other. Daniel's art didn't bring in much money at first, But his passion was infectious. Emily believed in him, and together they built a life full of small joys that wealth could never buy. Emily found work at a local gallery, helping out where she could. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough to get by. Slowly, they started to make their little apartment feel like home. Emily found herself embracing a simpler way of living, something she had never imagined herself doing. She learned to cook, to budget, to make things last. It was hard, yes, but it also brought a sense of satisfaction she had never experienced growing up surrounded by luxury. Their love grew stronger as they faced each challenge together. While Daniel struggled to sell his paintings, Emily was always by his side, encouraging him to keep going. She believed in his talent, even when the world didn't seem to notice. They weren't chasing after money or status. They were building something more meaningful, something that couldn't be measured in dollars. Occasionally, Emily would think about her father. She wondered if he ever thought of her, if he regretted cutting her off. But each time she considered reaching out, she stopped herself. She knew her father too well. His pride wouldn't allow him to accept her life choices, and she wasn't willing to sacrifice her happiness for his approval. As the years went on, Daniel's art started to gain some recognition. He wasn't a household name by any means, but he began selling pieces here and there. They weren't getting rich, but they were getting by, and that was enough for Emily. She no longer cared about the material things she had once taken for granted. She had found a different kind of wealth, one built on love, trust, and the life she and Daniel had created together. Still, there was a lingering sadness in her heart. She missed her father, despite everything. She wished he could see her now, not as the daughter who had disappointed him, but as the woman she had become. But the years of silence from him were a heavy reminder that some wounds may never heal. Meanwhile, back in his mansion, Charles remained as stubborn as ever. He had no interest in hearing about Emily's life, and he certainly wasn't about to reach out to her. To him, she had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. He told himself that she had thrown away everything he had given her, and he would never forgive her for that. But life has a way of forcing change, even for the most stubborn hearts. While Charles continued to live in his world of wealth and power, a series of events were set in motion that would soon bring him face to face with a truth he could never have imagined. As the years continued to pass, Charles Donovan's empire grew larger, but the man himself began to shrink. The power and wealth he had worked so hard to accumulate no longer brought him the same sense of satisfaction. His business continued to thrive, yet his personal life was in ruins. The mansion that had once been filled with activity and life now felt empty, echoing with the silence of his choices. Charles hadn't heard from Emily since the day she left, and in truth, he had made no effort to reach out to her either. His pride wouldn't allow it. He still told himself that she had chosen the wrong path and that she would eventually come crawling back, asking for forgiveness. But deep down, as the silence stretched on, a small voice started to question whether he had been too harsh, whether maybe, just maybe, he had lost something more valuable than his pride. As the business world kept moving forward, Charles found himself slowing down. He was aging, and it was becoming harder to keep up with the constant demands of running his empire. His once sharp mind was starting to dull, and he began to rely more and more on his top executives to manage the day-to-day operations. He could feel his grip on everything he had built slowly slipping away. Physically, Charles was struggling too. His health had begun to deteriorate, a fact he refused to acknowledge to anyone, including himself. His once powerful frame had grown frail, and small tasks that had been easy for him before now left him exhausted. But he refused to ask for help. He had always been the strong one, the one who didn't need anyone, and now, as his body started to fail him, he clung even tighter to that image. He still lived in his grand mansion, surrounded by the wealth he had accumulated, but it didn't bring him joy anymore. In fact, it only served as a reminder of the family he had lost. He spent his days alone, wandering through the empty halls, glancing at the family portraits that still hung on the walls. His late wife, who had passed away when Emily was young, stared back at him from one of the paintings, her eyes filled with the warmth he now missed so dearly. Emily had been his last connection to her, and now that was gone too. Despite his wealth, Charles had no one left to share it with. He had long since cut ties with most of his family members and trusted no one with his personal affairs. He had become a man isolated by his own decisions. And though he would never admit it, the weight of his loneliness was beginning to wear on him. The once vibrant man who commanded respect and fear was now an old, tired figure, walking the halls of a mansion that felt more like a prison. One day, as he sat in his study, he received a letter. This wasn't unusual. His secretary brought him correspondence regularly, but this letter was different. It was from his doctor, and the words inside carried a weight that Charles couldn't ignore. He had been avoiding the doctor's calls for weeks, refusing to deal with the reality of his declining health, but now there was no avoiding it. The letter was direct. His condition had worsened, and it was clear he didn't have much time left. Charles stared at the words in disbelief. He had always thought he had more time to build his empire, more time to live, more time to maybe reconcile with his daughter. But now, that illusion was crumbling before him. For the first time in years, Charles felt a pang of regret deep in his chest. He had always told himself that Emily's decision to leave was her mistake, but now he wondered if he had been the one to make the biggest mistake of all. He had pushed away the one person who could have been there for him now, the one person who might have cared for him in his old age. The weight of his choices began to sink in, but Charles wasn't ready to admit defeat. He had built his life on control, and even now he wasn't ready to let go. But the letter from his doctor left him with no choice but to confront the reality he had been avoiding for so long. As the days passed, Charles grew weaker. His once grand estate became a place of isolation and emptiness, reflecting the man he had become. But even as his health declined, there was still one thing he refused to do: reach out to Emily. His pride still held him captive, and despite everything, he couldn't bring himself to admit that he had been wrong. However, life has a way of forcing people to confront their mistakes, and soon Charles would be faced with a reality he could no longer ignore. As Charles's health continued to deteriorate, the once powerful businessman now spent most of his days confined to his bed. The grand estate that had once been a symbol of his success now felt more like a gilded cage. The servants who still worked for him went about their duties quietly, leaving him to his thoughts. But every day, the mansion grew quieter and lonelier, and the silence became unbearable. One evening, as Charles lay in his dimly lit room, staring blankly at the ceiling, a knock echoed through the halls. It was unusual for anyone to visit him, especially at this hour. He assumed it was his doctor, come to deliver more bad news, or perhaps a distant business associate checking in out of obligation. But it wasn't. The door creaked open, and the faint shuffle of footsteps entered the room. Charles turned his head slowly, his curiosity piqued, but what he saw nearly stopped his heart. Standing in the doorway was Emily. For a moment, Charles couldn't speak. He wasn't sure if it was the weakness of his illness or the shock of seeing his daughter after all these years. She stood there, looking older, more mature, but unmistakably his Emily. Her face carried a calmness that he hadn't seen before, and there was no trace of anger or resentment in her eyes. "Emily," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. It was the first time he had spoken her name in years. She walked toward him, slowly but deliberately, taking in the sight of her father, the once formidable man now frail and broken. Her heart ached to see him like this, but she wasn't here to dwell on the past. She had come for something more important. "I heard about your condition," Emily said gently as she sat down beside him. "I wanted to see you." Charles's pride flared for a moment. He wanted to snap back, to remind her that she had left, that she had chosen to walk away from everything he had built for her. But he couldn't find the strength. Instead, he nodded weakly, grateful that she was here, even if he couldn't admit it aloud. "How did you—" he began, his voice trailing off. "Daniel and I heard through some old contacts of yours," she said, her tone calm. "It doesn't matter how. I'm here now." The mention of Daniel's name made Charles's heart tighten. The man he had disowned his daughter for, the man he had never met but had loathed for years, was still a part of her life. Yet here she was, sitting by his bedside when no one else was. "Why did you come?" he asked, his voice hoarse. There was a bitterness in his tone, as if he still expected her to ask for something, to want something from him now that he was weak and vulnerable. But Emily didn't flinch. She looked him directly in the eyes, and for the first time in years, Charles saw the strength in her that he had never fully appreciated. "I came because you're my father," she said simply, "and because no matter what's happened between us, I don't want you to be alone." Charles was silent. The weight of her words settled over him, pressing down harder than any business deal or financial pressure ever had. He had spent so long pushing her away, convinced that she had betrayed him by choosing a life he couldn't understand. But now, as he looked at her, he realized that in the end she had found something he had never been able to give her: peace. For the first time in years, Charles felt the cracks in the walls he had built around his heart. His pride, his anger, his stubbornness, it all seemed so insignificant now. All those years of silence, all those years of thinking he was right. And yet, here was Emily, not demanding anything from him, not looking for an apology or an explanation. She had simply come to be with him, and it was more than he deserved. "I was wrong," Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper. It took every ounce of his strength to say those words, but once they were out, he felt something lift from his chest. Emily's eyes softened, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. The room fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that hadn't existed between them for so long. Charles lay there, feeling the weight of his life's decisions pressing down on him. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. After a few moments, Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped package. She handed it to him without a word. Charles looked at the gift, confused. "What is this?" he asked, his hands trembling as he held the package. Emily smiled softly. "Just open it." With shaky hands, Charles unwrapped the package. Inside was a simple, leather-bound book. He opened it to the first page, and his breath caught in his throat. It was filled with pictures. Pictures of Emily and Daniel's life together, of the home they had built, the small milestones they had achieved, and the love that had carried them through it all. There were notes, too, small, handwritten entries from Emily, telling the stories behind each photo. The words were filled with warmth, love, and a sense of peace that Charles had never known. As he flipped through the pages, he realized something profound. Emily had given him a glimpse into a life he had refused to see, a life filled with the kind of happiness that no amount of money could buy. "This," Charles began, his voice cracking as he tried to process the gift. "This is your life?" Emily nodded. "It's not the life you imagined for me, but it's mine. And I wanted you to see that I'm happy, Dad." For the first time in years, tears welled up in Charles's eyes. He had spent so long chasing after power and wealth, convinced that they were the only things that mattered. But now, as he looked at the life Emily had built, without his influence, without his money, he realized that she had found something far more valuable than anything he could have given her. It was a gift he never could have imagined. Charles sat in silence, the weight of the leather-bound book in his frail hands. Each page had revealed a piece of Emily's life, one he had shut himself out of for so many years. The photos, the memories, the happiness she had found with Daniel. It all felt like a world he had never known existed. As the pages ran out, his heart felt fuller and heavier at the same time. Full because of what he had finally seen, and heavy because of all the time he had lost. "I never knew," he whispered, barely able to find his voice. "I didn't think you could be happy without all this." He motioned weakly to the grand estate around him, the symbols of wealth and success that had once meant everything to him. Emily's face softened as she watched her father struggle with the realization that his vision of happiness had been so narrow. "I didn't need all of this, Dad. I just needed a life where love came first. That's what Daniel and I built together. That's what we wanted." Charles swallowed hard, his pride slowly crumbling under the weight of truth. He had spent his life believing that love and happiness came from wealth and status, that only through financial success could anyone find real security or peace. But here was his daughter, living proof that he had been wrong. She had chosen love over riches, and in doing so, she had found something far more precious. He turned his gaze back to the book, flipping once more through the pages. A picture of Emily and Daniel laughing on their small porch caught his eye. They looked so content, so unburdened. The sight of it twisted something deep inside him. This was a peace that he, for all his power and money, had never been able to buy. "I spent so many years angry," Charles finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Angry at you for leaving, angry at myself for not understanding why you'd choose him." He hesitated, the bitterness over Daniel's name still present but not as sharp as it once was. Emily nodded but didn't interrupt. She knew that her father's words, as difficult as they were part of the healing process they both needed. "I thought you were throwing away everything I had worked for, everything I wanted for you," Charles continued, his eyes now fixed on Emily's. "But I see now that you didn't need those things to be happy." "I didn't," Emily said gently, her voice steady. "But I did need you, Dad. I needed you to understand that love isn't about how much you have, it's about who you have." Charles closed his eyes for a moment, the full weight of his past decisions pressing down on him. The empire he had built, the wealth he had accumulated, all of it seemed so small now in comparison to what he had lost. Years with his daughter, moments he could never get back. He opened his eyes again and looked at Emily. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking, "for everything." Emily reached out, taking her father's hand in hers. The gesture was simple, but in that moment, it felt like a bridge across all the years of silence, the hurt, the pride. Charles gripped her hand tightly, holding on as if it were the one solid thing left in his world. "I never wanted us to end up like this," Charles whispered, his eyes filled with regret. "But I don't know how to fix it." "You don't have to fix it, Dad," Emily said softly. "We just have to move forward together." The words brought a kind of peace that Charles hadn't felt in years. He realized now that his daughter's return wasn't about making him pay for his mistakes or proving him wrong. It was about healing, about giving him the chance to reconnect before it was too late. Emily sat with him for hours that evening, talking quietly about her life, about Daniel, and even about the small things, like the flowers in her garden and the way the sun set behind their little house. Charles listened intently, absorbing every detail, every word. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of connection he hadn't known he needed. As the night grew darker, Emily finally stood to leave. Charles watched her, feeling a pang of sadness at the thought of her going. But before she reached the door, she turned back, reaching into her bag one last time. "I have something else for you," she said, handing him another small envelope. Charles took it, his hands trembling. "What is this?" "Open it tomorrow," Emily said with a smile. When you're ready." With that, she kissed him on the forehead, a gesture so filled with love and forgiveness that it nearly broke his heart. Then, with a final glance, she left, leaving Charles alone with his thoughts and the envelope. That night, Charles couldn't sleep. His mind was filled with everything Emily had said, everything she had shown him. For the first time, he realized just how much he had missed out on. But there was still time. In the morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through his window, Charles finally opened the envelope. Inside was a simple piece of paper, a deed to a small piece of land tucked away in the countryside. A letter was attached. "Dad, I know you spent your life building this empire, but I want to give you something that can't be measured in money. This land, it's ours. Daniel and I bought it a few years ago. It's quiet, peaceful, and I think it's exactly where you need to be. There's a little cottage on the property, and we want you to live there with us. We want you to be part of our family again." Charles stared at the letter, his heart swelling with emotions he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the land or the house that struck him. It was the offer of belonging, of family. Tears filled his eyes as he realized that despite everything, his daughter was offering him the one thing he had never truly had: a chance to be loved for who he was, not for what he had. For the first time in years, Charles allowed himself to cry, not out of regret or sadness, but out of the overwhelming sense of grace he had been given. Emily had given him a gift far beyond anything money could buy. She had given him a second chance, and this time he wasn't going to waste it.